You've been great partners on advancing methane policy at the state level in New Mexico, and happy to talk a little bit about MethaneSat this evening. As Jim mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs for Environmental Defense Fund. What that actually means is that I run our methane advocacy work across the U.S. We have a number of policy and program folks that work west, mid-continent, out east on both federal and state methane policy. So I am not an expert on MethaneSat, but I've done this presentation a couple of different times and am happy to talk about what I know on MethaneSat, how it could impact our collective advocacy. Happy to take questions, and for any questions that I can't answer, I'm happy to take those back to our technical team and circle back. So please make sure your questions get captured in the chat if that's the case, in case I do need to circle back with those answers. But let me go ahead and share our presentation. Yeah, Tom just said.
Matt, just let me jump in, something I forgot. So we will listen to Matt and like he said, put your questions in the chat, and then we will have plenty of time to have a question and answer discussion at the end of the show. Thank you.
Excellent. So an introduction to MethaneSat's mission and capabilities. So first, a little bit on Environmental Defense Fund. We were founded in 1967, and we are a international environmental organization. And our goals are to stabilize the climate, strengthen people and nature's ability to thrive, and support people's health. We are really founded on the bedrock of facts. So scientists, economists, policy experts, and lawyers, and our network of partners and allies around the world. And we are about delivering results for communities, results for our environment, ensuring climate justice, advocating for smart policies, and championing diversity. From a methane perspective, our primary goal is to achieve a 75% reduction in oil and gas methane pollution by 2030, and that is worldwide. So why do we care so much about methane? So methane is responsible for about a quarter of the climate change that we're experiencing today. Oil and gas is the largest source of US methane emissions. It is also the primary constituent of natural gas. So, when methane emissions go up in the air, it's a climate issue, it's a public health issue, it's also an energy waste issue. And as I know, some folks may know all too well, air pollution is released alongside methane. So that is VOCs that form smog or ozone, as well as hazardous air pollutants like benzene or toluene, which can create other adverse health impacts. Methane is challenging. It's a slippery molecule. You can't see it with your naked eye. You need some sort of technology to be able to find and fix the leak. Here's a little bit of methane by the numbers. So nationally, we estimate there are about 16 million metric tons of methane released annually. That is about $2 billion worth of natural gas and enough energy to meet the need of 14 million homes. Here in New Mexico, there is about 1.46 million metric tons of methane released. That's the equivalent of 29 million passenger vehicles or 32 coal-fired power plants. That is about $311 million worth of natural gas that could serve 2 million homes. So why did we, an environmental group, decide to launch a satellite? Well, I talked a little bit about why methane is a problem. And in 2012, we started organizing a series of independent studies that produced 50 peer-reviewed scientific papers to assess methane across the US oil and gas supply chain. And what we eventually found, I think that paper came out, I want to say 2016 now, 2018, somewhere around there, is that emissions were, at the time, we estimated 60% higher than EPA estimates. That this is a worldwide problem. And so this led EDF and its partners to build a global campaign, again, with that 75% reduction goal. But to really know how we were going to address emissions, we needed empirical measurements, right? I think people may have heard the phrase like no data, no problem. We need the data to show exactly the extent of the problem, whether or not we're making progress on it. So, methane technologies are, it's too difficult to do ground-based measurement alone or even aerial technology alone. Satellites have a unique role to play in terms of being able to measure methane emissions over a region or particular area. So there are satellites, and I'll talk a little bit about the ecosystem of satellites, but there are some that see very large scale and some that see very small scale. And we're kind of MethaneSat is in between. And so let's go. So I'll talk a little bit more on like MethaneSat, methane air, and then the data platform through this presentation. So again, our goal is to quantify methane emission rates from multiple sectors, including at least 80% of oil and gas production regions. So we are going to look at other industries such as agriculture, but we're right now, our initial focus is on oil and gas production. Our purpose is to provide radical transparency through freely accessible methane data on a global scale. So this is, we want this data to be out there in the world and to be usable. We launched in March, on March 4th of last year. MethaneSat will have a planned lifetime of 5 years, and we're hoping to have the data to begin flowing in early 2025. So hopefully soon, and that's starting to roll out there. And it lists a few of our partners there below. MethaneSat will, again, cover about 80% of the world's oil and gas regions and 130 targets. Each target will be 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers. And these sites are located in 48 production basins across the globe. So this gives you a sense of where we're going to point MethaneSat when looking for emissions from the oil and gas sector in particular. Obviously, we could point in other regions for other targets. So I talked a little bit about the ecosystem of satellites. So, people may remember Tropomi and the methane cloud that hovered over the four corners. That was really a kind of breakthrough that changed the whole narrative, both in New Mexico and nationally, in terms of the scope of the methane problem. And that's where scientists from NASA and University of Michigan found a methane cloud the size of Delaware hovering over the San Juan Basin. But the resolution from Tropomi is not very detailed, right? And so we're going to see larger hotspots, but we're not necessarily going to have a lot of accuracy for measuring area emissions. And Tropomi is not going to see point sources. On the other end of the spectrum, you have GHGSat and Carbon Mapper that are good at seeing specific point sources from oil and gas operations. The challenge, though, in some parts, right, is it's a little needle in a haystack. You got to know where, when to look at what well site and find those emissions. And so MethaneSat can help us see kind of a view in between those two, where we'll be able to look at regional emissions or emissions in a basin and really be able to see area emission hotspots. MethaneSat can see some point sources, but GHGSat and Carbon Mapper are both set up better for that. Whereas MethaneSat's real value here is the ability to see area emissions and to measure area emissions. So this is more just talking about how these nest together. So you have the high emitting point sources, you've got area sources, and then total regional emissions within a basin. Why are area emissions important? Well, for a long time, I want to say a long time, there has been off and on a lot of focus on what are called super emitters, are high emitting point sources. And the fact is that super emitters alone can't explain the level of methane emissions that we see out there using MethaneSat or other technologies. I want to say there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40%, probably closer to 30% of emissions we think are from super emitters. And what we've really learned over time is that diffuse area emissions make up a significant component, if not the vast majority of emissions in a given region. So when you've got that spider web of oil and gas wells out there, yes, those point sources are a huge contributor, but it's not just the point sources, it is those area emissions, and we need to be able to address both of those. So here's how we're going to use MethaneSat, right? Methane data is gathered, it is processed, it is made available through the free web portal and the Google Earth Engine cloud platform. And then methane data hopefully gets used out there in the field. And we have a few proof of concept cases that I'll talk about. So methane air. Before we sent up a satellite, we took the same technology and attached it to an airplane or methane air. And this was to make sure we knew the resolution and what we were going to see, and could the technology do what we wanted it to do? Did changes need to get made to it? And so starting in, I want to say 2021, 2022, 2023, we did a series of overflights using methane air. So here's an example of emissions in July through October 2023 in the Delaware Basin and the Midland Basin. And again, this kind of gives that sense of like area emissions versus point sources, right? Those circles being point sources. Right. And then again, this is a chance for us to be able to see emissions, high levels of emissions from point sources. Okay. There's a map of the different basins that we surveyed with methane air between June and October 2023. So we looked at about 70% of onshore oil and gas production. And here's what we found. So I know you folks are interested probably in New Mexico specifically. The Permian Basin had about 1.9% emissions rate. I don't have a great breakdown between New Mexico and Texas. And I will say that our overflights in the Permian did not capture as many of the marginal wells on the Texas side. So, as we, I'd say this is a little bit better than a snapshot, but as we get more data throughout the year from MethaneSat, we'll come to have a much better understanding of what total area emissions are in the Permian Basin and elsewhere like the San Juan. So, but the Permian Basin had a 1.9% leak rate. You'll notice that like Haynesville, Appalachia are lower. That's because those are primarily a gas play. Gas plays always have lower emission rates. One of the things that was super interesting is that basins like the Piceance and the Uinta Basin are super, and Greater Green River Basin are super high, like 5%, almost to 8%. And so these are really older oil and gas fields. So it's interesting that all three basins had a kind of similar issue. I don't think that I think the San Juan Basin actually probably has made some progress and is going to be somewhere between the Permian and the Greater Green River, but we don't have that data available yet, but we will. Any questions on this? Is this a good time to ask on this one in particular?
Yeah, Matt, I have a quick question. Would you tell us what methane loss rate means?
Yeah, so methane loss rate is could also be called methane intensity, and it is the amount of gas emitted, but doesn't include flaring, over the amount of gas produced. And part of this is a scientific definition of methane intensity. It's a little bit different than, say, OGCI and how they approach it, where flaring's in the numerator. Um, but for methane loss rate, it's a methane intensity, and it's the amount of gas uh, lost over the amount of gas produced.
And those numbers, gas produced is the kind of numbers that industry reports to the government of various kinds, or how?
Um, well, gas produced is something that we typically have more faith in, right? Because that's gas that they're selling primarily, right? And so we've got a good sense of the amount of gas that's produced. That's not all gas brought to market. There is some nuance in there depending on which definition of a loss rate or intensity that you're using.
Okay, right.
So you'll notice, right, like the Permian Basin has, um, not the highest leak rate, but by far and away the highest emissions, and that is just because of the sheer amount of production that's happening in the Permian Basin.
And Matt, just to finish the questions on the slide. So
Yep.
the the purple portion of the bar and then the dark blue portion of the bar, GHGI, is that what is kind of the estimate that the federal government uses, the EPA, think
Yeah,
was leaking? Or
there's a couple. I don't know all that goes into the estimates on how to figure out the total amounts, but yes, that is, what we saw with methane air, and then to round out the rest of the basin, estimated greenhouse gas emission estimated portion.
right. So the greenhouse gas, the estimated portion for the Permian is like around 50, and what methane air measured was 250.
Well, I think I could be wrong about this, but I think that that is what they used to measure or to estimate the emissions for the areas that weren't methane air didn't fly over. So I think we used that to fill the gaps. That's not a comparison between the two, I
Ah,
think.
okay.
I believe that is how we looked at the overall emissions in those basins.
Okay. That might be I'll make a note of that for follow-up.
Yeah. Excellent. Um, more maps. I think it's a little redundant here. Go ahead and move on. This gives a little bit of a difference between methane air and MethaneSat. And it just gives, I think this is a great illustration of how much more we'll be able to do with MethaneSat. And Tom, I think that gets at some of the first question we were bringing up earlier. So, methane air can look at 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer square. MethaneSat, it's 200 by 200. Methane air can do 4 targets per week at that 100 by 100 square. MethaneSat can do 30 targets per day. So that's a pretty big difference in what they're able to observe. And, it takes 2.7 hours to do a target with methane air. It's 30 seconds with MethaneSat. So huge differences just in the amount of time and coverage on there. So, big benefits to taking for MethaneSat over methane air. And that gives you a few other comparisons in terms of, so one thing that's interesting here is the point source. So MethaneSat point source, it says 500 kilograms per hour. I think it might be a little lower than that actually. So kind of conservative there. Methane air can see a point source from 150 to 200. I think the EPA definition of a super emitter is 100 kilograms per hour. So that gives you an idea of, from aircraft, you're going to be able to see those point sources a little better, even with the same technology, right? Methane air and MethaneSat. Whereas MethaneSat, we're only going to see the really, really big super emitters. So, great. And data platform. So this is up now. So if you go to methanesat.org, and I believe that was shared in the chat, right now it has the methane air data from 2023. But you're able to toggle in the bottom left to look at specific overflights. This is a snapshot, so I can't do this in real time. And then here was some observations in Q2 of 2024. You'll notice mostly what we saw were area emissions, right? And then here, over by Denver City and then Kermit, this is where we saw larger point sources. And so that'll be above that 400 or 500 kilogram per hour rate. So again, MethaneSat's not great at seeing super emitters unless they're really large super emitters, but this gives you a sense of the data. So again, it's a tool to help address emissions. From a operator example, it could help a company, for instance, decide where to deploy leak detection and repair crews to help monitor facilities that are remote, unmanned, or operated. They could integrate this with their existing operations, right? So this could be a tool for companies to better understand the emissions for their fleet of wells, and to use technology more efficiently to go out there and address emissions. From a regulator or government example of use cases, again, being able to understand regional emissions, infrastructure, to know where the gap might be, to know whether or not enforcement is taking place, as an example, and whether or not we're really making progress in reducing emissions with the rules being implemented on the ground. I know Tesla and SpaceX are not people's favorites right now, but if you wanted to watch the launch of MethaneSat and others, you can scan that QR code, and it'll take you to the SpaceX page. It'll show you when that launch happened. It's pretty amazing to see. There is my contact information, MethaneSat website, where you can follow our energy program for energy transition on X and LinkedIn. And that is the presentation.
Hey.
Thank you, Matt. That's pretty exciting stuff. Just a kind of a general program overview question. Satellites sound to me, I don't have one, but they sound expensive. How did you guys pull this off?
It was expensive. We are really lucky that our president and CEO is pretty good at fundraising, and so he was able to get the capital invested to be able to do that launch.
Do you have a dollar figure handy?
I don't have a dollar figure handy, so.
All right. Thank you.
I know, for instance, like Bezos Earth Fund was one of the folks that helped funded it, among many others, but I don't know the list of funders.
Okay. Great. Yeah, maybe we should, Tom, what is the chat doing? Do we have some questions?
Yes, we do. I just Googled your question, Jim, and the answer I got was $88 million
There you go.
for MethaneSat. But yes, as to questions, I noted that in your list of sponsors was Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab now owns the Albuquerque business formerly known as Sol Aero, which is a solar space cell company located in Albuquerque. Were they involved in making MethaneSat?
If they're up there, my answer is yes, but I don't know what their role was. So.
Okay.
Yep.
They, if I had to guess, they probably made the solar cells that powers the satellite. They are a manufacturer of highly efficient solar cells for space applications.
Yeah, I did get a chance to tour Ball Aerospace and see the monitoring technology in person, but that's as close as I got to the seeing the technology side of things.
Good. Well, there were a couple of other questions, so let me just get to them. Steffi asked, do any of the 3 methane satellites you showed depend on federal funding for agency participation operations and data storage and sharing, and for methane enforcement into Mexico. So given the turmoil at the federal government level, that's a pertinent question. So what do you know?
Yeah, the answer for ours is not. I think that's actually true for all the different programs out there. And forgive the bouncing between screens. There's the Mars program under the UN, the Methane Alert and Response System. They have been in a lot of conversations about potentially being able to have some sort of clearinghouse there for some of the information. Obviously, we're putting ours online and available publicly. But I think for, the satellites know that, it's kind of, once they're up there, they're doing their thing and sending the data back. And so, a lot of our time and focus and cost is all on, crunching that data and making it make sense to the general public. So,
Okay,
but no, we're not relying on government dollars.
cool. Or cooperation.
Right, right.
Excellent. Okay.
But there, I think Carbon Mapper was approved as part of the super emitter program. And so that is an example of a program where, if Carbon Mapper saw a large point source emission, and again, I talked a little bit, we see the area emissions, Carbon Mapper is better at seeing point sources, that would then, under the EPA methane rule, trigger a response from EPA to ensure that super emitter was addressed. So I think, that's certainly something we're paying close attention to is, what could happen to the super emitter program.
Matt, I just had a follow-up. You mentioned in the presentation that MethaneSat could be of use to industry and government. Can you give us some specific examples of those kind of interactions with those different types of institutions?
Yeah, I think, and the data isn't all online yet, so this is a live conversation. But there are states like New Mexico and Colorado and California, for instance, that are all working to get more accurate state level inventories for emissions. And there's a lot of different tools out there, to do that. And MethaneSat is something that regulators could incorporate as they're developing inventories. We're really pushing state governments and the federal government to move toward empirically measured emissions versus what we do now, which are engineering calculations. There was an update to Subpart W from EPA that improved the system that EPA used, but there's a lot of opportunity to use empirical measurement to get more accurate picture of what's happening. And MethaneSat will really be a game changer from that perspective. But that data is not online yet. So I think we're going to see, how this plays out kind of in real time. From an industry perspective, it's been super interesting. I won't say where, but there was a basin where it was noticed that there was a large point source. There was an operator there who noticed it and told their neighbor, hey, you should make sure that you take a look at this, which was a really interesting thing to see, companies talking to each other about what's being seen to address a problem in the region. So.
Thank you.
Thanks. Matt, here's another question. So one of the major concerns going forward with global warming is as the oceans warm and the Arctic permafrost melts, there are enormous stores of frozen methane in those areas, and there are signs that they are starting to melt and leak and then go up into the atmosphere. Is MethaneSat has MethaneSat seen any signs of leakage in the Arctic permafrost or the deep oceans, or could it, do you think?
I'm going to say I'm going out on a limb here a little bit. I think it can see area emissions, right? And so if area emissions because of Arctic permafrost, um, are starting to thaw, increase, MethaneSat should be able to see that. We obviously would need to be pointing it to that target, but I don't see any reason why MethaneSat wouldn't be able to see a large increase in methane emissions from permafrost. I think the oceans is a little bit more difficult because I'm not sure how that, methane, I'm assuming it'll be diffuse when it's coming up out of the ocean.
It's bubbles.
So yeah, so I would be doubtful on that. I know, for instance, like we've been trying to figure out the best way to get accurate data for like offshore oil and gas. It becomes more challenging to be able to measure emissions for offshore oil and gas operations. Something to do with like sun and reflecting off the waters and cloud cover and all those things just create different types of challenges. So that's really why we're very focused on onshore. Although I know that we're looking at and trying to figure out how to make progress on offshore. But just knowing that it's difficult for offshore oil and gas, I very much doubt that we would be able to measure what's coming out of the ocean, especially if it's diffuse.
Okay.
I have never asked anybody on our science team that, so I'll just put a little qualifier on that, but I feel like that's a solid answer. So,
Okay. Good. Thanks.
yeah.
Nancy asked, you mentioned the MSAT info would be a tool for both industry and regulators. Are either of those being done now? If not, how would you envision that happening? Would regulators include state government?
Yeah, I mean, the state that's kind of the farthest along on this is really Colorado, where, it adopted a methane intensity standard that then incorporates a verification rule and protocol to be able to measure, report, and verify emissions. As part of that, operators themselves are deploying measurement technologies. Some are using like Bridger for aerial measurement. Others are using Cube for continuous monitoring on site. We've really encouraged it to be a multi-technology approach because there really isn't a one size fits all kind of solution there. But what we anticipate or hope is, as MethaneSat data becomes available and the state starts to update its inventory and assess what the methane intensity is for different oil and gas producing regions in Colorado, that they will use MSAT data to be able to provide a estimate of what those emissions are.
Thank you.
There was a question earlier on landfills. Sorry.
Yeah, I was about to get to that. Is this
Okay, great.
for regulating other methane emissions from ag and landfills? Are these significant enough to apply resources to?
Yes, yes. And I think we're focused on oil and gas in part because it's a little bit easier, right? Like you've got a point source, you know where the well is, you know where to point the camera. But yes, it'll definitely help inform decisions on agriculture and landfills. And I know there's a lot of interest on that. Colorado, for instance, is moving forward on a landfill methane rule as we speak. So I think there will be more and more interest on addressing emissions from those sources. Coal mine methane, right? We'll see, large methane emissions from large, coal mine methane sources.
Cool. I just had a thought popped into my head. So given that you are now measuring in, actual measurements of methane leakage, is there any sign, or maybe was there any sign of the EPA changing their estimates in their algorithm of methane leakage that applies kind of across the government and so many other areas that to align more with the real data that you're taking versus the industry estimates that they were previously using?
Yeah, no, because the technology wasn't up there yet. So, right, they were writing the rules before the technology was up there. So, obviously, our hope would be that we continue to make improvements to Subpart W, and that they would start incorporating more empirical data in those estimates.
Okay.
I've got another question, Matt, for you. It sounds like we're still a little bit early in MethaneSat reporting in terms of getting the data. Can you walk us through a little bit the data acquisition and how that's working? If you can. I know we're getting up into the weeds here, but
Yeah. I wish I knew more on that. Jim, I think if you follow up with me offline, I'll see if I can get more detail on it. But we've worked with folks at Harvard and folks on the EDF team, and we're using Google Earth Engine to be able to make that data available. Obviously, there's noise in there, and so we have to be able to get to the signal from the noise, and so that's a lot of what that team is doing.
Great, thank you. It sounds like that satellite generates an enormous amount of data. It sounds like quite a challenge.
Yeah, and again, I think we will have data available soon for folks to be able to look at from MSAT. And right now, you can go online and see the data that we collected from methane air to get a sense of, again, what folks will have access to.
My next question is probably way premature, but when you outlined how MethaneSat came to be, there was quite a long timeline. And you also, I think, said that this life expectancy of the present satellite is 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So are we starting to think about the next one?
No, not that I know of, but that maybe that's incorrect. So I've not heard talks about the next MethaneSat. And 5 years is the minimum life expectancy. Sometimes you will get quite a bit more life out of these satellites. So it may very well go several years after. We just don't know. But 5 years is the expected life.
Is that a function of the low Earth orbits, the orbit decay, or is that the instruments? Or I'm sorry, I'm kind of.
No, I wish I knew the answer to that. I do not. So.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, this is great fun for me. I hope people are enjoying themselves. How about some more questions? I'm sure there's lots that we haven't thought about.
There's one more, and then maybe we can throw it open to the audience. So, question really is about, is the resolution of the satellite good enough to see leakage at the municipal level, like individual gas lines in distribution systems to houses and businesses inside a municipality?
No. So MethaneSat specifically will see diffuse area emissions. So it might be able to see like how much methane is over Albuquerque, but it's not going to be able to see a particular problem at a particular house. What you really need is consistent, leak detection and repair standards to be able to find those leaks. And so, for instance, there was a rule passed by PHMSA that increased leak detection and repair for downstream emissions from pipelines. Unfortunately, it looks like that rule has currently stalled out and has not been published in the Federal Register. Although Congress directed PHMSA to adopt a rule to increase standards. So we'll kind of see what happens with that. But the safety issue is very real, and we need utilities out there regularly finding and fixing leaks. So there are solutions to that. MethaneSat is not one of them.
Right.
Yeah, and for instance, like utility scale distribution pipelines, MethaneSat and GHGSat and Carbon Mapper can see emissions from those. A lot of utilities will, either do flyovers with aerial flyovers or helicopters, right? So planes or helicopters to be able to see those emissions for pipelines. So there's different like technologies that get deployed in the field there to find emissions.
There was actually back, I guess a decade ago, or at least, Google stepped up because Google, has their trucks going around taking pictures, Street View. You ever
Yep.
seen Street View? And they put some methane detection equipment on some of those vehicles, and they got fascinating results. One of the things they found, like older cities like Boston, had a terrible distribution leak rate, and newer cities not so bad. But it was, yeah, it was that stuff is available, and it seems like that's something that we can talk to the New Mexico Gas Company here and see what they're doing and what they can do better.
Yeah, we actually partnered with Google on that. I don't know if we did Boston, but we definitely did in Pittsburgh, for example. So,
Okay.
um, and Tom, I see your question on regulatory. Has it been used for enforcement action or violations? The answer is no. And we're really MethaneSat is not. I think you missed this when you were off for a bit, but MethaneSat will only see the really large point source emissions. Carbon Mapper and GHGSat are better positioned to see what we would call super emitters. Carbon Mapper was approved by the EPA under the EPA Methane Rules Super Emitter Program. So we'll see how that plays out. We obviously need to see how the current administration responds to the EPA methane rule and if they pursue any changes and, particularly to the super emitter program. So methane stat data is not online yet. So obviously that hasn't been deployed, but I know the state of California has its own state program where data or emissions seen by satellite are actionable. So I don't know how much or how often that's been used, but California does have a program.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
That was, I think, all of the questions in the chat that were written. Does anybody want to come off a mute and just ask a question or have anything to talk to Matt about? If not, we can probably start wrapping.
I have another question.
Okay, go ahead, and then I see Ken has his hand up, so go ahead.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Matt, I know you also are in charge of policy at EDF. What do you see for the next 4 years? What do we need at the state level? By the way, SB4 was tabled 6-5. So we are now, the purpose of that bill was to codify the governor's emissions reduction goals. So can you tell us anything what we should be doing?
Yeah, so I think in the state of New Mexico, one is we need to get SB4 passed, which includes a methane intensity standard. I see Tom shaking his head, so maybe
we're just this is a brutal recent defeat, Matt. I'm just trying to protect you from
I appreciate it.
yourself.
Okay,
but we'll see.
And then I think the state of New Mexico has committed to commencing a rulemaking to implement the EPA methane rule. That is an opportunity to get additional regulations to cut emissions. And so supporting the state's efforts to adopt those stronger standards at the state level under state authorities will be extremely important. There is going to be a vote on the on the waste emissions charge, which is a fee that's assessed to the largest polluters. That will have a vote in the House, and we think the Senate, possibly this week. So if you haven't called your representative to tell them to vote no on the CRA, please do. If they vote the right way, please thank them, because this will not be the last bill that they will have to vote on regarding oil and gas methane emissions. So we want to make sure they feel supported in supporting methane regulation. So those are, I think, a couple of immediate pieces, like engage the state, support their efforts in the rulemaking, post legislative session, and support your members of Congress in the vote on the CRA this week on the waste emissions charge.
Do we know what the bill number is for that?
We do, but not off the top of my head. You know what, Jim and Tom, I'm happy to follow up offline with the toolkit, and it's got all the information there. And you guys probably have already seen it at some point in time. But if you wanted to distribute that to your list, this is great timing.
Okay.
And why does it look easier in Colorado?
I think, there are some institutional reasons behind it. One, the state is just not as dependent on oil and gas revenue in the way that New Mexico is. We have a much more diverse economy on there. And so I think that creates more political will to do things. I think, too, industry is willing to come to the table a lot more in Colorado. We just adopted the regulations to strengthen provisions for pneumatics, and it was with the support of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association and with API. So, that is a remarkable difference to how rulemakings have played out in New Mexico. So there's just been more willingness to come to the table and support win-win solutions. And that's good for Colorado, too, because it means the policies are more resilient and less likely to get rolled back. And it helps us ensure that the rules are implementable on the ground. I think, another part of it is just history. So, which you guys now have in New Mexico, and I think that'll make this next rulemaking more successful. Not that the last ones weren't successful, but I think that teased you up for more success. So in Colorado, again, we passed our first rule 11 years ago. That was with then Governor John Hickenlooper. It was with the support of the three largest independent producers in the state of Colorado. At the time, the major producers were opposed to methane regulation. So that's a pretty big difference in terms of how things have shifted among industry. And, that really became a hallmark for Hickenlooper. And, success breeds success. So, that's, I think, part of it.
Okay, thanks. Ken, did you have a question?
No, I raised the applause button,
Oh,
not the hand button.
Okay. Sorry, Ken.
Yeah, I think that's, we can take that discussion, Steffi's point, the difference between what's going on in Colorado and regulating the industry. And then we talked about New Mexico. The other place to compare about is Texas. Do you have can you share with us a little bit about the regulatory environment in Texas?
I think even in Texas, the industry knows that it needs to move toward a, zero emission approach on methane. I think the regulatory environment is a lot harsher. Obviously, their AG was one of the people that opposed the EPA methane rule, Paxton. I think, a lot will depend on what ultimately happens at the federal level. However, a lot of consumers are moving to a place where they want cleaner energy. And if the oil and gas industry wants to remain competitive, I think both like nationally and globally, they're going to have to address their methane emissions. I don't think there is a future where oil and gas can ignore this problem.
Thanks,
Well,
Matt.
I think EDF needs to be congratulated because until very recently, that's exactly what they did. And they did it by subterfuge in terms of no data, no problem, or we get to define the data. And so hats off to EDF. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Ken? Antoinette has her hand up. Antoinette.
I was just going to reply to that last question a bit. So I work for the Sierra Club, and one of the things that I've learned in some of our work, because we have part of El Paso and West Texas, is that in Texas, for the regulation question, it's really hard to challenge an air permit for bad actors, that they have an arbitrary guideline that they use, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality that handles our air permits, where you have to live within 1 mile of a facility to challenge it. And sometimes they'll approve people that live within 2 miles. So that makes it really hard to challenge bad actors in Texas. So just wanted to share that. So it really does matter what the federal government does when it comes to regulating Texas.
Thank you, Antoinette, for that. I just let people know that Antoinette is very involved in the issue of regulating methane emissions, and she did a wonderful speaker series for us some time ago.
Awesome. Thank you, Antoinette. That was super helpful. And I guess the other point too is like that's part of the whole point of MethaneSat, right? Which is, to add daylight to, what or sunshine, what's the right metaphor I'm looking for here, to the problem in Texas. And so it's going to be, harder to ignore because it won't be a no data, no problem. There will be data and there will be a problem. And the question will be, how does industry respond? How do regulators respond? And and some companies are trying to get out ahead of the curve and have implemented practices in the field to cut emissions. So that just shows that it's possible. Now we just need everybody in industry to do those practices, and that is a little more challenging.
Okay. Matt, people asked if they could have access to your very nice slide deck. And I typed in the answer that you gave me that you would ask. So
yeah,
hoping that they'll say yes.
I'm sure that will be fine, but let me ask the MSAT team. They're very particular about their public facing material, so we'll get you something. So.
Okay, good. And my intent is to process this recording and send it out in this week, but maybe within a couple of days. So if you can get that to me, I'll include it as an attachment.
Yeah, I can probably turn that around tomorrow. And please do send me a list of the questions that I said, let me get back to you on. And I'm happy to on those.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe we have one more if no one else has any more.
Go ahead, Steffi.
And I'm sorry if I didn't hear you say this earlier, but is the methane plume in the Four Corners still there?
Some of the time. Yeah, so what others and researchers have found is that it is intermittent, so it's not there all the time. And so we've moved toward talking about how there are significant emissions in the San Juan Basin, but that like methane cloud, is my understanding, is intermittent. And so the emissions in the Permian are going to be much more significant in comparison to the San Juan Basin, but that doesn't mean that the San Juan Basin isn't an issue that needs to get addressed.
And I know I heard people from the oil and gas industry say it came from, and I think you said this too, coal seeps, and there wasn't any way of controlling that. Is that true?
My understanding is that is very inaccurate. Yes, coal seeps contribute to methane in the Four Corners, but we can also see the methane coming from the oil and gas well sites. And NASA, JPL did some follow-up. I haven't looked at these studies in like years, but I believe that their findings were specific to oil and gas. So,
well, there's another Matt. There's another dynamic that happens, and I found out about talking with people about the coal bed methane development in Wyoming. So when you drill in to develop coal bed methane sources, you actually stimulate seeps. So there's a dynamic between those two.
Yep. Yeah, and I don't I've not looked at the issue for the San Juan Basin in some time. And I know there had been some of that kind of development, at least on the Colorado side of the border, but I don't think it's very active at the moment. So
Yeah, well, a lot of that coal bed methane predated fracking.
mhm.
So the fracking development has overwhelmed that kind of development.
Yeah.
All right.
So I guess, Tom, sounds like you're planning to process this video, and we'll put it on the website. I would also urge people to take a look at the archives of the speaker series. There's a lot of fascinating stuff there. If you might have missed some of them, I know there are some regulars on here tonight, but we also have folks that maybe this would be one of the first times they've been on speaker series, and this is typical for the kind of really gritty kind of stuff we talk about. This is a little on the wonky side, but in general, it's very gritty.
Well, it was a pleasure to be here tonight. So thanks for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And